Many people believe that this edition of the World Economic Forum is more important than any other. We have seen communal tension right across the border in France. The host's own currency is in a bit of a spot here. US seems to be recovering, but the rest of the world is in a deflationary downdraft. How do you assess this new global context, which also happens to be the theme of Davos this year? And what are the biggest risks the world faces in 2015?
Well, good morning, and thanks for talking with me today. I think every year is important. I've been coming to Davos for a number of years, and it seems like there's always something significant like we have this year happening as we arrive in Davos. So I think it will be an important conversation this year. Geopolitical risk, I think, will dominate a lot of the conversation, and frankly, it's dominating my conversations with CEOs leading up to Davos. I think CEOs are very much worried about the economic impact of the geopolitical risks that we're seeing around the world, and I think that's going to continue to get a lot of attention.
I'm glad you mentioned the geopolitical risk to begin with. I thought I'm going to touch upon that a little later, but because you start with that, we are seeing communal tension in the world, say the one with the Charlie Hebdo case in France, the rise of ISIS. Businesses are not equipped to deal with something like this. This is a new risk. What are you advising businesses to do on this matter?
Well, I think that's a perfect reason why gatherings like Davos are so important, where we bring government leaders and business leaders and other significant global leaders together, because no one can solve this on their own. The problems that we're facing globally are things that governments can't attack on their own, businesses can't solve on their own, and what it takes is the kind of collaboration that conferences like Davos, I think, are intended to really kind of facilitate.
I'm going to speak to you about the economic landscape that the world is seeing. This is a bit of a distorted recovery that the world is seeing. US seems to be recovering faster than most people had anticipated. Europe is in deep trouble, especially with the situation in Switzerland, and then, of course, the political turmoil in Greece. China is slowing down. India, yes, seems to be an emerging market darling. In this distorted global recovery, can US be the single engine of growth that it once used to be?
I think it's important for all boats to be rising for a healthy global economy. It is important. The U.S. leadership from an economic standpoint can be very important, but the U.S. cannot do it on its own. And I think what we need is a balanced recovery with consistent policies to the extent we can achieve them around the world. And you're right, we are seeing now a very uneven and patchy economic landscape. And we've all got to be working toward developing those kinds of policies, whether it's consistent regulatory policy, tax policy, immigration and trade policies, all of those things which I think can create a more balanced recovery and a more balanced playing field across the world.
How big or how deep are the fault lines as far as Europe is concerned? Because many people believe that ECB stimulus notwithstanding, there is no political buy-in for the fiscal stimulus, which is actually required for an economy like Europe right now. How deep are the fault lines in Europe to begin with, and how worried are you about those?
I think Europe is challenged, and it will be economically a very challenging place, I think, for several years. This is going to be a slow return to economic growth and vitality in Europe. And frankly, you've got very different. It's difficult to talk about Europe as if it's a single entity. You have very different dynamics taking place across a number of key countries in Europe. And I think the more we can get political leadership in Europe coalescing around some common responses, and as I said before, developing the kind of consistent economic policies, I think we'll all be benefited.
This is also a world where the deflationary downdraft seems to be the new normal, and which is why we're seeing unconventional monetary policy being used as a tool to stimulate growth across the world. So be it the ECB or be it Japan or even China for that matter, there is a lot of resonance with monetary policy acting as a stimulus. Do you believe that is a safe option to go by because we have no other options right now?
I think it's not the preferable option, but I think in a situation where you have limited options at your disposal, it's been a very effective option in certain places of the world, including the U.S. And we've seen, I think, the positive impact of stabilizing an economy and turning an economy to growth from a U.S. standpoint. So I think different countries will adopt different policies in that respect. Frankly, from a deflationary standpoint, you've got different economies in very different places along those lines. I think what we're seeing in oil prices today is something we're going to have to watch very carefully in a number of economies to make sure it doesn't continue to exacerbate that deflationary problem.
I'm going to just touch upon oil in a bit before I move on. I want to speak about China because a lot of people are worried that there are asset bubbles that are beginning to burst there. The economy is slowing down. What does the meltdown in China mean, A, for the rest of the world? And how worried are you about that meltdown in China? Do you believe the government can still get in control and stem the crisis, so to say?
Yeah, meltdown in China would be a little strong in terms of what I'm seeing and what most of the companies I'm meeting with, I think, view the China situation. Certainly, growth is slowing. I think most CEOs I meet with are expecting growth to slow over the next couple of years in China. Having said that, it's still growing in relation to a number of other large economies, and frankly, the kind of policies aimed at the structural reforms that I think are going to ensure that China has a long-term period of sustained economic growth in a sustainable way, I think are really important, and most people are supportive of them. So I think you've got to balance the short-term economic impact with some of these long-term structural reforms that the leadership in China are trying to drive.
You mentioned oil and how countries should watch against low oil. So we have seen peak oil and now we are seeing cheap oil. How much should the world be worried about cheap oil? It lost a lot of sleep over peak oil. How much should they be worried about cheap oil? Because while it's good for importers like India, it is catastrophic for oil producing countries.
You know, it's like most things, it's a very complicated situation because on the one hand, you have from a consumer standpoint, and much of the economic recovery that we need to achieve around the world will be driven and led by consumers, so it's very good from that standpoint. Consumers, it's almost like getting a tax cut in terms of what's happened here recently from oil price standpoint. Having said that, there are oil-producing countries as well as the energy sector in places like the U.S. has been a big part of leading the economic recovery. So it's a double-edged dynamic, and I think there will be winners and losers in this environment. And what we have to hope for, I think, is something that stabilizes in a range that will be positive for consumers and also allow the energy sector and those oil-producing countries to continue to sustain growth.
Do you expect oil to be for a prolonged period at a very low level?
You know, I think most of the people I talk to expect these levels, while they may be slightly rising from where they are today, to be at a generally low level for some period here. I don't think anybody I'm talking to expects a very short-term recovery back to the prices we had seen in the last year. So I think generally speaking, we're entering a period where people expect relatively lower oil prices.
I'm going to shift focus to India because there seems to be this new euphoria around it. Do you believe India is back in the reckoning with a new leadership, a new government, the whole Make in India campaign really resonating here in Davos?
I think there's tremendous excitement. From a U.S. standpoint, there's great optimism about the new leadership in India and what the kinds of reforms and policies that Prime Minister Modi is promoting. I was at a gathering in Washington when Mr. Modi was meeting with the president, and very positive, very optimistic group of U.S. leaders, and that's what I feel around the world as I meet with people, that a lot of work to be done, a lot remains to be seen, but a great sense of optimism about the new leadership in India.
So the big sales pitch of India for this World Economic Forum here in Davos is the Make in India campaign, the government making a huge sales pitch there. There are obvious challenges to this, so we'll rank very low in the ease of doing business. What, according to you, are some of the things that the world will be asking of India here at Davos?
Well, I think first the kind of structural reforms to allow the kind of long-term sustained growth in India will be very important. The ease of doing business, the rule of law, all of those things that will enable businesses to invest confidently in India, that's probably high on people's list in terms of what we need to see. Infrastructure investment in India to allow the kind of economic growth that I think India has the potential of driving. And then just from a various industry sector standpoint, the kind of broad policies across India that will allow that economy to really achieve its potential, which is huge.
The last time we were at Davos, the world was losing a lot of sleep over the retrospective tax that India did introduce. Many CEOs that we spoke to thought that was the one issue alone that killed the investment climate in India. Mr. Jaitley, the finance minister, did not put that ghost to rest. He did say there's not going to be any retrospective taxation. A budget is right around the corner. As the head of KPMG globally, would you urge the finance minister to lay that ghost to rest? Do you believe retrospective tax continues to be an irritant in investment?
Well, I think the one thing that you can always be sure of is uncertainty is a very bad thing for investment anywhere around the world. And the possibility of anything retroactive or retrospective creates a level of uncertainty that certainly depresses, I think, investment that would otherwise be taking place. So I'm not going to advise the leaders in India in terms of their policy decisions, but I think it is very clear that anything that raises that kind of uncertainty is not good for investment, and I would hope would be avoided to the extent possible.
I have one last question to ask of you in India before I let you go. There is internally in India as well a debate on make in versus make for India. Do you believe the world has the capacity to absorb another export-led economy after China, and has China yielded some elbow room to India for India to seize?
I'm a big believer in all boats rising, and I don't think there's a zero-sum game. I don't think for one country economically to win, someone else needs to lose, and I think the world will be stronger and we will have a much more confident global economy when all of our major economies, including India, are performing to their potential.
Thanks very much for speaking to us. Always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.